When Lieutenant Cutler's fist connected with the woman's jaw, he thought he was putting an insubordinate, low-level contractor in her place. He smiled, expecting her to crumble to the floor. He had no idea the woman wiping the blood from her lip was a Tier 1 Navy SEAL, and her real retaliation was only just beginning. The air inside the Tactical Operations Center at Camp Lemonnier, Djibouti, was thick with the smell of stale coffee, ozone from the servers, and the underlying tension of a high-stakes deployment. Outside, the East African sun baked the tarmac, but inside the air-conditioned tent, the atmosphere was freezing. Chief Petty Officer Chloe Masterson stood near the back of the briefing room, her arms crossed over her chest. She was dressed in sterile desert camis, no NAMA tape, no rank insignia, and certainly no special warfare trident pinned to her chest. To the uninitiated, she looked like an intelligence analyst, or perhaps a logistics coordinator, who had wandered into the wrong briefing. In reality, Chloe was one of the most lethal operators on the continent. Having quietly survived and graduated with Bud S-Class 334, she was a pioneering female operator attached to a specialized DevGru squadron. She didn't broadcast her achievements. Her calloused knuckles, the knife-edge vigilance in her eyes, and the quiet respect of the men in her unit did all the talking she needed. At the front of the room stood Lieutenant Brad Cutler. Cutler was a newly minted officer out of Annapolis, sporting a perfectly pressed uniform, a prominent class ring, and an ego that entered the room a full 5 minutes before he did. He had been assigned as the ground force commander for the Conventional Quick Reaction Force, QRF, supporting an upcoming night raid into a hostile border region. Cutler was currently tapping a laser pointer against a satellite map projected onto the whiteboard. "We pushed the convoy through Route Charlie," he declared, his voice carrying the practiced booming cadence of a man who loved to hear himself speak. "It's a direct line to the Tardik compound. We secure the outer cordon, wait for the extraction signal, and roll out." Textbook. Chloe stared at the map, her brow furrowing. Route Charlie was a winding dirt road that cut directly through a steep, rocky Wadi dry riverbed, flanked by high ridges. It was a natural fatal funnel. "Lieutenant," Chloe's voice was calm, cutting through the hum of the generators. "Route Charlie is a choke point. If you push a heavy convoy through that wadi, you'll be sitting ducks from the ridgelines. You need to route them north, through the open flats. It adds 20 minutes, but you won't get boxed in." Cutler stopped tapping his laser pointer. He slowly turned his gaze to the back of the room, looking Chloe up and down with undisguised contempt. He saw a woman, slightly dusty, lacking any visible authority, daring to interrupt his tactical briefing. "And you are?" Cutler asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Masterson, tactical advisor," she replied evenly, not shifting her stance. "Right, an advisor," Cutler sneered, looking back at the handful of young Rangers and Marines in the room, inviting them to share in the joke. None of them laughed. They were too focused on the map. "Listen, sweetheart, I don't know how they do things in the supply shed, but in combat operations, we rely on speed and momentum. I'm not adding 20 minutes to my response time because a desk jockey is afraid of a few rocks. It's not the rocks I'm worried about, Lieutenant. It's the DSHK heavy machine guns the local militias favor placing on elevated terrain," Chloe countered, her voice dropping an octave, losing its conversational tone. "If you go through Route Charlie, you will lose men." Cutler's face flushed. His authority was being challenged in front of his subordinates, and by a woman no less. He slammed the laser pointer down on the table and marched down the center aisle, stopping inches from Chloe's face. He towered over her, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. "Let me make something abundantly clear to you," Cutler hissed, spit flying from his lips. "I am a commissioned officer in the United States Navy. I don't take orders, suggestions, or tactical advice from unranked civilians who read a book on asymmetrical warfare. You will keep your mouth shut, or I will have you removed from this base." Chloe didn't blink. She didn't step back. She merely looked up at him, her eyes dead and cold. "Rank doesn't make you bulletproof, Cutler. Change the route." The absolute lack of fear in her voice broke something in Cutler's fragile ego. In a blinding flash of temper and misplaced arrogance, Cutler's arms snapped up. His closed fist struck Chloe squarely on the left side of her jaw. The sound of the impact echoed sharply in the silent tent. Several men in the room gasped, chairs scraping loudly against the floorboards as they instinctively stood up. Chloe's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. She took half a step back to catch her balance, the metallic taste of blood instantly flooding her mouth. The room held its collective breath. Everyone expected her to scream, to cry, or to run out of the room reporting the assault. Instead, Chloe slowly turned her head back to face him. She raised a calm hand, wiping a smear of blood from the corner of her lip. She didn't raise her fists. She didn't shout. She just stared at him with a predatory stillness that made the hairs on the back of Cutler's neck stand up. It was the look of a predator, calculating the exact amount of force required to end a threat. "You're making a mistake, Lieutenant," she whispered. The swaggering entrim of the voice was far more terrifying than a yell. Cutler, trying to mask the sudden spike of adrenaline and regret in his veins, puffed out his chest. "Get out of my briefing room. Now." Chloe held his gaze for 3 more seconds, searing his face into her memory, before turning on her heel and walking out into the blinding African sun. News of the assault spread through the Tier 1 compound like wildfire. By the time Chloe reached the hooch she shared with her squad, her teammates, Petty Officer First Class Hayes and Senior Chief Miller, were already gearing up. Hayes, a mountain of a man from Montana, was racking the slide of his sidearm with furious intent. "Where is he?" Hayes growled the moment Chloe walked in, noticing the dark purple bruise already blooming along her jawline. "I'm going to break both his legs and feed his Annapolis ring to the feral dogs out back." "Stand down, Hayes," Chloe said, tossing her tactical helmet onto her cot. She walked over to a small mirror and prodded the bruise. "He hit like a civilian anyway." "He struck an operator, Jinx," Miller said, using her call sign. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Rank or no rank, officer or not, we don't let that slide." "I'm going to the commander." "The commander already knows," Chloe said, grabbing an ice pack from the mini-fridge. "And nothing is going to happen." She was right. Within the hour, the base commander, a politically minded captain named Rogers, called Chloe into his office. Cutler was sitting there looking smug. Rogers gave a long, exhausted sigh, rubbing his temples. He spun a narrative about high stress, misunderstandings, and mutual insubordination. Cutler's father was a 2-star admiral at the Pentagon, a fact that Rogers subtly wove into his lecture about the importance of unit cohesion. Cutler was given a verbal reprimand and ordered to stay away from the intelligence annex. The incident was officially swept under the rug. Chloe accepted the verdict with a blank face, offering a crisp salute before leaving the room. She knew the military justice system was flawed, but she also knew the battlefield had a way of sorting out the weak from the strong. 2 nights later, Operation Sandstorm was greenlit. The target was a high-value trafficker operating out of a fortified compound near the Somali border. Chloe's SEAL team, call sign Trident Actual, was tasked with the hollow, high-altitude, low-opening insertion, dropping silently onto the compound roof to neutralize the target. Lieutenant Cutler's mechanized QRF was positioned 5 miles out, ordered to move in and provide a security perimeter once the target was secured. At 0200 hours, the ramp of the C-17 lowered into the freezing night sky. Chloe, clad in full tactical gear, quad-node night vision goggles pulled down over her eyes, stepped off the edge into the black void. The wind roared in her ears during freefall, a chaotic symphony that she found deeply comforting. At 4,000 feet, she pulled her ripcord. the canopy snapping open and violently arresting her descent. Trident Actual landed on the compound roof with the silence of falling snow. Within 4 minutes they breached the skylights, descended into the top floor, and methodically cleared the rooms. Suppressed HK-416 rifles coughed quietly in the dark. The opposition was neutralized before they even knew they were under attack. The HBT was zip-tied and secured. Command, this is Trident Actual. Jackpot. Target secured. We are ready for exfil, Miller whispered into his comms. Copy. Trident Actual. QRF is en route to your position, the radio crackled. 5 miles away, Cutler was riding in the lead MRAP, mine-resistant ambush protective vehicle. High on the adrenaline of his first real combat deployment, and eager to prove his dominance, he grabbed the radio handset. Driver, take route Charlie. Let's make good time. Sir, Intel advised against route Charlie. It's a known ambush zone. The driver, a young corporal, hesitated. I give the orders, Corporal. Turn down route Charlie. Now, Cutler barked. The heavy convoy turned off the main highway and descended into the rocky, steep-walled wadi. The moonlight was swallowed by the shadows of the cliffs. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the grinding of heavy diesel engines on loose shale. Then the night exploded. An RPG streaked down from the eastern ridgeline, slamming into the engine block of the lead MRAP. The explosion flicked the massive vehicle onto its side, showering the canyon in sparks and jagged metal. Instantly, the ridgelines on both sides erupted in muzzle flashes. D-Sheik heavy machine guns tore through the darkness, their armor-piercing rounds ripping into the unarmored sections of the trailing Humvees. Back at the compound, Chloe heard the frantic radio chatter erupt in her earpiece. Contact. Contact left and right. We are pinned down in the wadi. Heavy casualties. It was Cutler. His voice was high-pitched, cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. We are taking heavy fire. Need immediate air support. QRF, this is command. Fast movers are 20 minutes out. Dig in, the dispatcher replied calmly. 20 minutes? We'll be dead in 5. They're moving down the ridges. Cutler screamed into the mic. Chloe looked at Miller. The wadi was only 2 miles from their current position. They had the targets secured, but the extraction helicopters couldn't land if the QRF was being annihilated just down the road. They went through route Charlie, Chloe said, a voice devoid of any I-told-you-so satisfaction. It was just a cold, tactical fact. Miller checked his rifle. We can't wait for air support. Mount up. We're going hunting. Trident Actual commandeered 3 Technicals beat-up Toyota Hilux trucks with mounted machine guns from the compound's courtyard. They drove blacked out, no headlights, navigating purely by night vision. As they approached the mouth of the wadi, the sheer scale of Cutler's disaster became apparent. 2 vehicles were burning, illuminating the canyon walls. Cutler and his surviving men were pinned behind a cluster of boulders, completely suppressed by overlapping fields of heavy machine gun fire. Militants were bounding down the rocky slopes, preparing to overrun the American position. Cutler was huddled behind a rock, his pristine uniform covered in dust and another man's blood. He was hyperventilating, his rifle lying forgotten in the dirt. He had frozen. The textbook maneuvers hadn't prepared him for the deafening roar of real combat, the smell of cordite, and the terrifying reality of his own imminent death. Suddenly, a series of sharp, suppressed cracks echoed from the mouth of the wadi. Cutler watched in stunned disbelief as the militants advancing down the slope suddenly dropped one by one. There was no chaotic spraying of bullets. It was surgical. A militant would stand up to throw a grenade, and before his arm could complete the arc, his head would snap back, and he would collapse. Chloe moved through the chaotic battlefield like a phantom. Her movements were fluid, devoid of wasted energy. She bounded from cover to cover, her HK-400 Sting locked tight into her shoulder. She didn't spray and pray, she fired controlled pairs. Crack, crack. A gunner on the ridge slumped over his weapon. Crack, crack. A flanker trying to flank Cutler's position dropped into the dirt. She breached the kill zone, stepping into the firelight of the burning MRAP. To Cutler, she looked like an angel of death. Her face was obscured by her night vision goggles and a skull-patterned balaclava, but he recognized the build, the calm demeanor, and the way she held her weapon. Chloe slid behind the boulder next to Cutler. She didn't look at him. She slapped a fresh magazine into her rifle, leaned out, and dropped 2 more hostiles attempting to close the gap. "Get your weapon up, Lieutenant," Chloe barked, her voice cutting through Cutler's panic like a razor blade. Cutler could only stare at her, trembling violently. "We're going to die here," he whimpered. Chloe grabbed Cutler by the front of his body armor, hauling him up to eye level. The bruise on her jaw, hidden beneath her mask, pulsed with adrenaline. "You don't get to die today, Cutler," she growled, her eyes burning through the green phosphor of her goggles. "And you sure as hell don't get to get these boys killed. Pick up your rifle. We're walking out of here." The wadi was a meat grinder of flying shale, tracer rounds, and the agonizing screams of wounded men. Chloe released Cutler's armor, leaving him gasping against the cold stone of the boulder. She had no time to coddle a broken officer. The perimeter was collapsing. 20 yards to their left, behind the shredded, burning tire of the lead MRAP, Private First Class Jonathan Reyes was bleeding out. A piece of shrapnel from the initial RPG blast had torn through his upper thigh, severing the femoral artery. The young private, barely 19 and on his first deployment, was desperately pressing his hands against the geyser of blood, his face a mask of pale, wide-eyed terror. "Hayes, Miller. Suppress that ridgeline cyclic rate," Chloe barked into her comms, her voice an anchor of absolute authority in the storm of chaos. "Copy that, Jinx." "Raining brass," Hayes's deep voice rumbled back over the earpiece. A second later, the heavy, rhythmic thud of an M2040 Bravo machine gun echoed from the mouth of the wadi, tearing chunks of rock and dust from the enemy positions above. Using the momentary lull provided by Hayes's suppressing fire, Chloe broke from Cutler's cover. She sprinted across the open ground, bullets snapping the air around her like angry hornets. She slid feet first into the dirt behind the burning MRAP, immediately kneeling beside Private Reyes. "Look at me, Reyes," Chloe commanded, ripping a tourniquet from her chest rig. "Keep your eyes on my mask. I'm dying. I'm bleeding out," Reyes stammered, his body going into hypovolemic shock. "You're not dying today. I forbid it," Chloe said flatly. With practiced, ruthless efficiency, she looped the tourniquet high and tight around his leg, cranking the windlass down with a brutal yank that made the boy scream. The bleeding stopped instantly. She grabbed his combat webbing and hauled him backward, dragging him out of the immediate kill zone and behind the solid steel block of the vehicle's undercarriage. Cutler watched this from his pathetic crouch. He watched the woman he had struck in the face, the woman he had dismissed as a desk-bound liability brave, a literal wall of lead to save one of his men. His hands shook as he looked down at his own pristine N4 rifle, still clean, still unfired. A crushing wave of shame threatened to drown him, heavier than the fear of the bullets flying overhead. "Lieutenant," Chloe's voice cracked like a whip across the distance. "If you don't start firing, they will flank us from the east." Lay down suppressing fire. It took every ounce of Cutler's remaining willpower, but he finally hoisted the rifle to his shoulder. He squeezed the trigger, firing blindly at the muzzle flashes on the ridge. It was inaccurate, desperate fire, but it added noise to the defense. Chloe, meanwhile, realized that holding the line wasn't enough. The enemy had a DCK heavy machine gun entrenched in the rocky outcropping about 50 yards up the eastern slope. It was systematically chewing through their cover. The technicals at the mouth of the wadi wouldn't survive much longer against armor-piercing rounds. "Miller, you have tactical control. Chloe whispered into her mic. "And taking out that nest. Copy, Jinx. Go dark. We'll keep them busy." "Not." Chloe detached her night vision goggles, relying on her natural night sight and the ambient light of the burning vehicles. She slipped away from the main cluster of survivors, melting into the shadows of the wadi's eastern wall. She began to climb. Cutler lost sight of her. For 5 agonizing minutes the firefight raged on. Cutler fired until his bolt locked back empty, the metallic click a terrifying sound. He fumbled for a fresh magazine, dropping it in the dirt, his hands slick with cold sweat. High above, Chloe moved with the silent lethality of a ghost. She bypassed 2 perimeter guards, sliding her combat knife between the ribs of the first and snapping the neck of the second before they could utter a sound. She crested the outcropping right behind the heavy machine gun nest. There were 3 men, a gunner, a loader, and a spotter. She didn't use her rifle. The muzzle flash would give away her position to the rest of the ridge. Instead, she drew her suppressed sidearm. 3 muffled fut-fut-fut sounds barely registered over the roar of the DJHK. The 3 militants collapsed over their weapon, instantly neutralized. Down below, Cutler noticed the sudden glorious silence from the eastern ridge. The devastating heavy fire had stopped. Suddenly, the roar of jet engines shattered the night. The radio crackled to life with the beautiful, drawling voice of a fast-mover pilot. "QRF, this is Warthog 1-1. I see your IR strobes. Keep your heads down. We are bringing the rain." An A-10 Thunderbolt II banged hard over the wadi. The terrifying, earth-shattering burr roared, echoed through the canyon as the GAR-U-8 Avenger rotary cannon unleashed hell upon the western ridgeline. The sheer kinetic force of the 30mm rounds obliterated the remaining enemy positions in a massive cloud of fire and pulverized rock. The ambush was broken. When the extraction helicopters finally touched down, blasting dust over the wreckage, Cutler was numb. He watched as Chloe descended the ridge, her uniform torn and dusted with debris. She walked straight past him, grabbed the stretcher carrying Private Reyes, and helped load the wounded boy into the belly of the Black Hawk. Cutler boarded the chopper last. He sat across from Chloe in the dimly lit cabin. She was removing her helmet, wiping the grime and sweat from her face. The harsh red light of the cabin illuminated the dark, ugly bruise on the left side of her jaw. The bruise he had put there. She caught him staring. She didn't glare. She didn't look triumphant or vindictive. She just looked through him as if he were entirely inconsequential. In that moment, Cutler finally understood what a Tier 1 operator was. They weren't just soldiers, they were apex predators who existed in a reality he had only read about in textbooks. And he realized with sickening clarity that when he had hit her, she hadn't been intimidated. She had simply been calculating whether he was a threat worth ending. Camp Lemonnier was bustling with the frantic energy of a mass casualty return. Medics rushed to offload the wounded, while heavily armed contractors secured the perimeter. Private Reyes was rushed to emergency surgery, his life saved by the tight, brutal application of Chloe's tourniquet. 2 hours later, the debriefing room was silent. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Captain Rogers sat at the head of the long wooden table, a thick file resting under his folded hands. Lieutenant Cutler sat to his right, still wearing his blood-stained, dirt-caked uniform. Chloe sat at the far end of the table, flanked by Miller and Hayes. She was back in her sterile desert camis, the bruise on her jaw now a vibrant, swollen purple. Rogers cleared his throat, attempting to project an air of command that he didn't truly possess. Well, Operation Sandstorm was complicated. Trident Actual successfully secured the HVT, which is a massive win for the theater. The QRF ran into unexpected resistance. Rogers looked at Cutler, his eyes conveying a silent instruction to play along. "Lieutenant Cutler, your convoy was ambushed in an unmapped hot zone. Despite heavy casualties, you managed to hold the line until air support arrived. Your leadership under fire Stop. The single word cut through the room like a gunshot. It didn't come from Chloe. It came from Cutler. Rogers blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me, Lieutenant." Cutler slowly stood up. He placed his hands on the table, looking down at the polished wood. He looked utterly exhausted, broken down to his barest foundations. "There was no leadership under fire, Captain," Cutler said, his voice hollow. "Intel advised against Route Charlie. Chief Masterson advised against Route Charlie. I ignored them. I drove my men into a fatal funnel because I wanted to prove a point. Because of my arrogance, 3 of my men are dead and 5 are in critical condition." Rogers raised a hand, his face flushing. "Lieutenant, we are operating in the fog of war. Decisions are made in split seconds. Let's not rush to self-flagellation." I froze. Cutler interrupted again, looking up. He didn't look at Rogers, he looked directly at Chloe. "When the ambush hit, I panicked. I dropped my weapon and I hid. I left my men to die." The room was dead silent. Hayes and Miller exchanged a brief, hard look. SEALs despised cowardice, but they respected a man who owned his failures. Cutler reached up and unvelcroed the officer rank insignia from the center of his chest rig, dropping the patch onto the table. Chief Masterson broke the ambush. Chief Masterson saved Private Reyes. Chief Masterson took out the heavy weapons nest single-handedly. If she hadn't taken command of my men, none of us would have walked out of that wadi. Cutler turned to face Captain Rogers fully. "Furthermore, sir, I wish to formally amend my pre-mission report. The incident in the briefing room was not mutual insubordination. I struck Chief Masterson in the face, completely unprovoked, because my ego couldn't handle being corrected by a female contractor I deemed beneath my rank." Rogers looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Cutler's father was a 2-star admiral, a court-martial for assaulting an elite operator, and dereliction of duty in combat would be a monumental scandal. "Cutler, think about what you are saying," Rogers hissed through gritted teeth. "You're ending your career." "My career ended the moment I led those boys into an ambush," Cutler replied softly. "I am submitting my resignation, effective immediately. I am not fit to wear this uniform, and I am certainly not fit to lead men in combat." Cutler turned back to Chloe. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it, and he knew a warrior like her wouldn't care for empty apologies anyway. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod of absolute respect, the kind of respect he had previously demanded but never earned. Chloe held his gaze. For the first time since he had met her, the cold, predatory stillness in her eyes softened just a fraction. She gave a single brief nod in return, acknowledgement. He had failed as a leader, but in his final act he had found his honor. Cutler turned and walked out of the briefing room, leaving his rank patch sitting on the wooden table. 2 days later, the base was quiet. The sun was setting over the tarmac, casting long golden shadows across the concrete. Chloe was walking toward the armory, a heavy rucksack slung over one shoulder, preparing for her next rotation. She paused near the transport terminal. Lieutenant Brad Cutler was standing by a civilian transport plane dressed in plain clothes, carrying a single duffel bag. He was flying back to the States, facing a dishonorable discharge and a lifetime of ghosts. He saw her standing there. For a moment, neither of them moved. The bustling noise of the military base seemed to fade away. There was no hatred left between them, only the heavy, permanent scars of the reality they had shared in the wadi. "You were right," Cutler called out, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "About the route, about everything." Chloe adjusted the strap of her rucksack, her expression unreadable. She raised a hand to the fading bruise on her jaw, a physical reminder of the fatal miscalculation that had changed both their lives forever. "I know," Chloe said quietly. She turned and walked into the armory, disappearing into the shadows, a silent guardian returning to the dark. Cutler boarded his plane, leaving behind the desert, the uniform, and the hard-learned truth of what a Navy SEAL could really do. Did Lieutenant Cutler's resignation surprise you? Or was it the only honorable choice left after his fatal miscalculation? Combat has a way of stripping away ego and revealing the brutal truth underneath. If this gripping story of survival, elite SEAL tactics, and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible real-life military stories.